I think I really like the way that Jordan Peterson articulates it, but I think he misses the forest for the trees.
How so?
In that he sees Jesus as an archetype. And I don't think actually even Jesus gives you the opportunity to see him as the archetype. Because I have this love-hate relationship with all of Peterson's stuff, because he seems to get so much right where he walks up to the line, but he doesn't want to cross over.
And is the crossover, you think, connected to a life in academia? Or
No.
What do you think it is?
I wonder, and I'd love to talk to him about this, like how do you remedy this issue that, because he seems to think that the concept of Jesus as an example is more important than the actual flesh and blood first century itinerant Jewish preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead physically, which is the claim of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. That's an example for us to look on and live by. But I actually think that Jesus condemns moralism. And ultimately what I see Peterson doing is looking at Jesus as a moral example. And if Jesus is nothing but a moral example, then you can save yourself and you don't actually need a savior. And so I think actually Jesus would have critiqued that, because Jesus was very against moralism.
And how do you define Jesus being against moralism? Like, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, Jesus looks at the religiosity of his day with like particular groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are these other groups of Jews during his day. So we talked about the Essenes, who actually aren't mentioned in the Bible, but there are other groups like the Pharisees, who are like lay scholars, and the Sadducees, who are professional priest scholars. And he's constantly critiquing the fact that they have this hypocritical religiosity to them, where they're doing things like tithing their mint leaves, like to make sure that they get all of. This is where we get the idea of the letter of the law versus the intention of the law. Like Jesus critiques them for that, because he says, you're trying to do everything right and you're missing the point.
Huff builds his argument on a flawed premise, that Jesus' rebuke of Pharisaic hypocrisy, such as in Matthew 23:23, is a wholesale rejection of moralism. That's simply false. Jesus isn't condemning morality, he's condemning hollow, performative righteousness. In fact, he explicitly upholds the law. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others, he says, affirming that justice, mercy, faithfulness, and even tithing matter when rooted in sincerity. Far from discarding morality, Jesus calls for a deeper one, ethical integrity, not outward show. Huff's reading strips Jesus' words of their Jewish context and recasts a moral critique as a theological invention.
So when he says, you have heard it said, do not commit murder, but I say to you, anybody who harbors a hate for their brother in their heart has already committed murder. And what he's getting to is like, what's the intention? What's the meaning of the law that God gives to you? Because the law is like a mirror. It shows you how dirty you are. But his critique is, he's like, you guys are trying to clean yourself with a mirror. That's stupid. It's just if anything, it's gonna make you more messy. Like, get in the shower. The law is not what cleans you. The law is what reveals that you're dirty.
Wesley Huff claims that Jesus condemns moralism, arguing that viewing Jesus as a moral example undermines the need for a savior. He later uses a law as a mirror metaphor to suggest that Jesus taught the law reveals sin but doesn't cleanse, asserting Jesus' purpose was exclusively salvific, not moral. These claims are speculative. They go beyond anything Jesus is actually recorded saying. Nowhere in the Gospels does Jesus explicitly condemn moralism. Instead, he critiques Pharisaic hypocrisy, Matthew 23:23, affirms the importance of righteousness, Matthew 5:20, and gives concrete moral teachings like the Golden Rule, Matthew 7:12. Huff's law as a mirror metaphor isn't from Jesus, it's Pauline. Even then, Huff misreads Paul through a later Hellenistic lens. Paul says the law reveals sin, Romans 3:20, but also insists we uphold the law, Romans 3:31. In Romans 13:8-10, he roots Christian ethics in the law fulfilled by love. Paul's concern in texts like Romans 6:2 is justification, not abolishing morality or Torah observance. Huff's framework reflects a Hellenistic Christology that assumes Jesus rejected moralism to position himself as a divine savior. But that projection fits Greco-Roman theology, not a first-century Jewish teacher. From a Jewish Christian perspective, Jesus wasn't dismissing the law, but reaffirming its humane intent. When he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, Mark 2:27, it's not a rejection of Torah, but a call to honor its purpose. Sin, according to 1 John 3:4, is the violation of God's law, not vague moral failure. Jesus' teachings align with the Torah's ethical framework, law as guidance, not guilt trap. His message blends moral clarity with covenant loyalty, not a clean break from Judaism. Huff's view isn't rooted in the Gospels, it's retrofitted from later theological systems. In the formative centuries of Christianity, sharp disagreements emerged about the identity of Jesus, the relevance of the Jewish law, and what it meant to be a follower of Christ. Two major streams arose: Jewish Christianity, rooted in the teachings of Jesus and his earliest followers, and Hellenistic Christianity, shaped by Greek language, thought, and culture. Over time, Hellenistic Christianity grew dominant and labeled the other side heretical. But was it truly the more authentic expression of Jesus' message? Let's explore the theological battle that shaped early Christianity and revisit the forgotten voice of the Jewish Christians. Did the Hellenistic Christians, like Ignatius, label Jewish Christians heretics? Yes. Some Hellenistic Christians, like Ignatius of Antioch, viewed Jewish Christians who strictly adhered to Jewish law, e.g., circumcision, Sabbath observance, with suspicion and sometimes labeled them as heretics. In his early 2nd century letters, such as Letter to the Magnesians 8-10 and Letter to the Philippians 6, Ignatius strongly emphasized a distinct Christian identity separate from Judaism. He criticized those who live according to the law or mix Jewish practices with Christianity, arguing that Christ's teachings supersede the Mosaic law. Although Ignatius did not always explicitly call Jewish Christians heretics, he considered their practices obsolete and misaligned with true Christian faith. This contributed to a growing rift between Jewish and Gentile believers. Groups like the Ebionites, whose name means the poor ones, were among those marginalized. They maintained Torah observance and were later denounced as heretics by more developed Gentile-dominated church leaders such as Irenaeus and Epiphanius. Q. Were they also called heretics because they believed Jesus is the Messiah, not God? A. Yes. Many Jewish Christian groups, especially the Ebionites, were labeled heretics not only for keeping the law, but for rejecting the developing idea of Jesus' divinity. The Ebionites believed Jesus was a human prophet and the promised Messiah, chosen by God. They rejected later theological innovations such as the pre-existence of Christ or his being equal to God. Church fathers like Irenaeus, in Against Heresies, Book 1, 26-2, explicitly condemned the Ebionites for their low Christology and for clinging to Jewish practices. Ignatius of Antioch, although not fully systematizing doctrine, emphasized Jesus' divine role in letters like Letter to the Smyrnians 1, laying groundwork for later formulations. The Ebionites' views stood in stark contrast to emerging orthodoxy, which increasingly equated salvation with belief in Jesus as divine. Q. Which interpretation of Jesus' identity appears more consistent with his original Jewish context, Jewish Christianity or Hellenistic Christianity? The Jewish Christian, Ebionite position that the Father is the only true God, Jesus is the human Messiah sent by God, and the Torah remains valid, appears more grounded in Jesus' teachings as preserved in the Gospels, particularly when prioritizing sayings with strong historical plausibility, e.g. Mark 12:29, Matthew 5:17, John 17:3. These teachings align closely with Jesus' Jewish monotheistic context and messianic role, requiring fewer interpretive layers to fit their theology. In contrast, Hellenistic Christians, who developed doctrines like Jesus' divinity and the Trinity, often relied on ambiguous or less historically certain verses, e.g. John 10:30, I and the Father are one, or John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am, which are open to multiple readings and appear in the later, more theologically developed Gospel of John. They also drew on broader New Testament texts, e.g. Paul's writings, John 1:1-14, that reflect Greco-Roman philosophical influences, weaving these into a high Christology that diverges from Jesus' Jewish framework. This process involved more interpretive elaboration to construct doctrines not explicitly present in Jesus' core synoptic teachings. Thus, the Jewish Christian position hews closer to the straightforward sense of Jesus' words in their first-century Jewish context, while Hellenistic Christian doctrines depend on selective, often ambiguous verses and later theological frameworks to support their claims. But were the Jewish Christians truly heretics? From the Hellenistic Christian perspective, yes, but that judgment rests on assumptions rooted in later theological developments and institutional authority. Leaders like Ignatius and Irenaeus believed their doctrines were divinely guided and that the Jewish Christians had deviated from apostolic tradition. But let's break this down. Scriptural interpretation. Hellenistic Christians cited texts like John 1:1 and Philippians 2:6-11 to argue for Jesus' divinity. Jewish Christians prioritized the Shema, Deut 6:4, Mark 12:29, and Matthew 5:17-19, texts affirming the oneness of God and continued relevance of the law. Apostolic tradition. Hellenistic leaders claimed to preserve the apostles' teachings through bishops and institutional continuity. Jewish Christians, however, could argue that they were closest in theology and lifestyle to Jesus and his original Jewish apostles. Numerical dominance. Orthodoxy often equated numerical dominance with truth. As Gentile Christians became the majority, their theology dominated, marginalizing the minority. Theological coherence. Hellenistic Christianity emphasized theological systems, e.g., Incarnation Trinity, while Jewish Christianity required fewer metaphysical claims, presenting a more historically grounded Jesus. Power and polemic. Labeling groups like the Ebionites as heretics also served to consolidate power and define boundaries. The word heresy, from Greek heresis, originally meant choice or party, but came to mean deviation from orthodox truth as defined by those in power. Conclusion. While Hellenistic Christianity eventually established itself as orthodox, it's important to recognize that Jewish Christianity was not necessarily heretical. It simply lost the political and theological battle. The Ebionites and other early Jewish Christians represented a stream of faith deeply connected to Jesus' original teachings and context. Their theology, affirming one God, a human Messiah, and the continued validity of God's law, offers a historically grounded alternative that deserves respectful reconsideration. In the quest for truth, numerical dominance or philosophical sophistication should not be mistaken for fidelity to Jesus' original message. Final note: the history of early Christianity is not a simple tale of heretics and orthodoxy, but a complex, often painful struggle over identity, power, and truth. Revisiting the voices once dismissed helps us see more clearly what was gained and what may have been lost. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, we invite you to subscribe, like, and share this video. Your support helps bring forgotten chapters of history back into the light. Join us as we continue to uncover the roots of early Christianity and the voices that shaped its path. Thank you for watching.